I was standing on the porch of that house that you see there, the home of Martin Luther King Jr. as a child in Atlanta, Georgia. I was a park ranger. There is a National Park Service site with his neighborhood, or dedicated to his old neighborhood, right in downtown Atlanta. I was a graduate student at University of Georgia, and I was working as I went to school at this site. That's the home that the young ML, as he was known, grew up in. And as I was on that porch with a group of kids, aged 9 to 13, and a chaperone, I was having a conversation as we walked through the neighborhood and arrived at that moment before I opened the door. Now, these kids, preteens, let's call them, had a lot of scars, lashes on the back of the neck, a deformed skull that looked like it had been pushed in. Clearly, these kids had been through something. But what I learned from the chaperone is that they were slaves. This is in 2010. So let's say they were born around the year 2000. They're still in their early 20s. They were escaped, or they had escaped, from Haiti in the illegal human trafficking trade. So in front of my eyes in 2010, I was looking and interacting with enslaved children. That's why they had those scars. And I asked why they were here on this spot with me, ready to lead them into the home of a young Martin Luther King who was their age at the time that he was in this house, because they moved out of this house when he was 12 years old. And they said, this is the place they wanted to come. Recently out of Haiti, they wanted to come here. The power of the sense of place, of the individuals that they felt connected to a man that had died decades prior, and who, of course, had nothing to do with Haiti. But that also spoke to the power of legacy, of an American hero, the power of legacy of the person and the connection they felt to that legacy. Even as foreigners of a younger generation, through this place. So that's the power of a sense of place, the power of a historic site. And it can transcend the meaning that even you and I could imagine if we were there, having never encountered these kids. For me, it was a moment that came kind of full circle. Because there I am, as a park ranger on a Civil War battlefield. I had started my career for several summers working at Gettysburg, the battlefield, of course, in Pennsylvania, still the bloodiest and the largest battle in the history of North America. And of course, y'all might know, there's a unit there called the Louisiana Tigers. So they fought at Gettysburg, so I remember covering them. Now, I'm not sure if LSU got Tigers from there, but I think it'd be really cool if they did, right? But 100 years prior to Martin Luther King's peak was this battle at Gettysburg. I'd also worked, of course, at Richmond National Battlefield Park for one summer, which is the former Confederate capital at the time of the Civil War. And that park has a series of Civil War sites, battlefields, medical sites, even a naval site, and industrial site, all under the administration of one park, because there was a lot happening when you're at the capital city, right? So I had worked north-south, Union, Confederate, and then now something 100 years later, fighting over some of the same issues that were intertwined with the American Civil War. When you look at this space, you think of hallowed ground. There's only one of each of these sites. And it's a good place for us to remember and pause and think about the difference between a historic site and a monument. because this is part of the crux of many of the fights that we have today. We often hear that monuments are history. And I think these stories are very complicated, and we'll get into it a little bit here today. But it's important for us to distinguish between the sites where things happen and the monuments that commemorate a particular person or event that may or may not be tied to the location. The historic site is here. Now, this one happens to be the battlefield at Malvern Hill, outside of Richmond, Virginia, from July 1st of 1862. There's only one, Malvern Hill. And there's only so many of these Civil War battlefields in general, period. Many of them actually have been lost to development, subdivisions, suburbs, and they often name them after the generals who fought there, the streets. I've seen them, General so-and-so, General so-and-so, even though they've destroyed the battlefield. But we still have some of these. And the historic site, to me, is singular. It's the place where maybe, you know, the battle occurred, or the place where maybe the sit-ins occurred. If you're looking at the civil rights movement from Martin Luther King's era, it's one place. It's Martin Luther King's home that connected to those kids. The power of a historic site. Monuments, though, are a little bit different. Monuments are not necessarily tied to the historic site. They may or may not be. Sometimes they're on site, often they're not. I could have a monument in my front yard. I could have a monument in my town square. I could have a monument at a university. I could have them all kinds of places, right? It's not necessarily tied to the historic site. Now, there are monuments sometimes that are on a site, and that gets a little complicated. But what these are is a couple of views, or a couple of frames, if you will, from TV segments that I participated in as a historian on the topic as this issue was happening in 2020, 21, still happening a little bit, but of course was bigger in the news in 20 and 21. This was in Washington, DC. WUSA is the CBS station in Washington, DC. And here we're talking about a Confederate monument. And here it was in New Mexico. You can see the show New Mexico Living, which is on the Fox station in New Mexico. And you can see, I love that headline there, a monumental question. It's a question. And part of what I'm going to walk you through here today is a series of questions. That's a framework on how to approach these issues. What's interesting in New Mexico, you're seeing a portion of a larger monument that has multiple pieces to it that is to the Spanish conquistadors. Now there, it's not about necessarily the Confederates, although there was some Civil War action there. And it's not about the English so much. It's more about Spanish colonialism and how that interaction with the indigenous people that are there. There are many tribes that are still in New Mexico, and that interaction continues to this day, both with conflict and harmony, depending on what you're looking at, what family you're dealing with. It's the wonderful complexity and tapestry of humanity, right? Sometimes there's going to be conflict, and sometimes there's intermarriage and harmony, and sometimes it's both at the same time. That's how this stuff works. But the interesting thing is that it's not just North and South. It's not just Civil War, but it plays out in different ways across the country. Now, kind of cool, this one on the right, this piece on the right won an Emmy. So we covered it pretty well. An Emmy award, of course, is a TV award. So again, historic sites are where the place where these things occurred. Monuments, I would say, are depictions, as you see here. And they're usually not where the event happened. This is to Oñate and his settlers. Oñate is one of the Spanish conquistadors. Oñate never really hung out on that spot, but it's a dedication, right? So going back to where I was, as I mentioned, I had come full circle. I had dealt with these issues over and over. I had been at historic sites. I had been at historic sites with monuments. I had certainly, on my days off, traveled around and looked at all kinds of monuments around me that I could, because I was in Pennsylvania and Virginia. Talk about history-rich places, right? So this is when I began to formulate these questions, because while it has been in the national news for the last couple of years, this monument controversy and historic sites that people mix together, but I like to separate. It's always been an issue in local communities all the time. When I was in Richmond, Virginia, that was an issue with Monument Avenue for many years. And Monument Avenue recently got national attention, but locally that was always brewing, that was always happening. And I know here in Louisiana that has happened in some of the River Road plantations. These issues have played out for many years, even if they didn't always get national attention. And so to me, it doesn't have to get national attention for it to be valuable in us understanding how we can deal with these. So here's a process I want us to walk through as we go through the 4 questions. It's really simple. First, I ask that we look for something that surprises our perception. Because I think when you surprise yourself, when you're willing to step outside what you think you already know to get a surprise, you're provoked, hopefully in a good way, to reflect. So that's step number 2, provoke reflection. XYZ is not exactly what I thought. It's not exactly how I saw it. Maybe it's not the only way to see something, but there are multiple ways to see something that can be valid. And finally, therefore, hopefully, to inspire learning. Because as we always said in historical interpretation, which is when we, as park rangers, give tours, we're not supposed to just give facts. We're supposed to do a theme and a program and help you connect to the resource, because there's only so many facts you can memorize, right? But if you connect to the resource and I inspire you to learn, we have the seed, not the tree. There is so much more to learn than what I have here today. But if we go through that process of surprise perception, provoke reflection, and hopefully we inspire learning, so you all can learn more about whatever particular areas that you're interested in. So question number 1, why remember? Remember, we're gonna go through 4 questions for the blueprint that I believe allows us to have better understanding over historic sites and monuments, especially if we run into conflict with each other. So why remember? That goes to the first question, significance. Why does this matter? Because if we can't get past that, I'm not sure everything else matters, everything else counts, right? Because we have to be able to answer that question of what is the significance. I think the significance at, say, the battlefield at Gettysburg is pretty obvious, right? But it doesn't always have to be that huge. It could be significant to your family. It could be significant to your local community. So for fun, give me a few that you guys think of for why remember. What does that question mean to you? You can shout it out. What else? And my folks in the class, I can hear you in my ears. So if you shout something, I can hear it.
Some kind of a victory, but have I said that? And I say victory over what?
Okay.
Not over.
So can I say overcoming, or is that because you were, if you're talking about something over what, I thought of overcoming. Is that fair? All right. As I go through, you can shout some more because I think it'll stimulate your minds. Okay. So feel free to jump in. I have no notes. I know this stuff cold. You're not going to throw me off. So here's a local example. How about we look at Evergreen? One of my very favorite sites in the entire country. One of the first sites I visited when I first came to Louisiana in 2009. And I was just a visitor. Well, I guess I'm still just a visitor, but I didn't have the family ties that I have now. So Evergreen was my favorite. For me, the reason I think about why remember is because this is one of the most significant sites, not just because it's another plantation home, but particularly because you can see the outbuildings around it. It's incredibly rare to find the outbuildings around these homes anywhere in the country. And I don't have the photos going behind it, but there is 19 slave quarters that are in the back as well. So you actually see a slave row. I've traveled a lot of places. I've never seen that. You might find a home, like a slave house, but not a slave row. You see what I mean? So you can see the entire community. There are countless books that have been written on the slave communities that were created in the context of the plantation world. So to me, being someone that likes to see the whole picture, I like to see the interaction, because you have 100, 200 people here at some point in time, of course it changes across time, that are interacting in some fashion, right? And it's really kind of like a mini factory there, right? A mini processing plant where it's a particular avenue of business, right, with agriculture, but all these outbuildings and people are coming together and fitting together. So to me, it's one of the few places that you can see the entire picture from the main house all the way to the communities outside and the supporting system economically. And I believe they're classified as a historic district as a result, rather than a historic building. So to me, when I think of why remember, that's very significant before we even get to the stories. How about this? The atomic bomb. This is from the world's first. Why remember? So I'm gonna write these still. Here's my marker in my hand. Sacrifice. Achievement is a big one, yep. Yeah, to me, it's like this part of this right here, right? Overcoming and victory. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I missed that earlier. And can I also put on there like deterrent? Would that be part of it too? Cautionary tale, deterrent, it's kind of related. Now, to me also, when I think about the moment, without even looking into the future of a deterrent or hopefully a deterrent and so on, I think of the moment changing world history. Not just in geopolitics, but how about the scientific achievement in there leading to nuclear medicine, which saves lives, nuclear energy, constantly a topic of debate today. So it's not just war, but it's all this technology that came out of it and all the pluses and minuses and discussion that comes out of it. But certainly, I think we would all agree that it's significant. It answers the significance question very well. Why remember? Well, how about this? There I am in the right side, talking about the history behind the Russia-Ukraine invasion when this was initially happening. Of course, it's still ongoing. Well, why remember history in this case? Well, it helps inform and understand, I would argue, current events, which is what was happening here. So I had my, it's okay. I didn't lose my thought, it's all right. So what's important here is to remember the context, right? Because this helps provide context. So why remember? Significance? Well, suddenly, Russian colonial history of the steppe region, which is what that area is known as, matters. Now it's significant. Didn't feel so significant when I was taking a graduate course on it, like 8 years ago, 10 years ago, but all of a sudden it was significant. And I pulled those notes out to help remind me of what's going on here. So sometimes these things can change, right, in level of significance. But sometimes it's fun. It's not always, I feel like I went down a dark path here with the nuclear war and Russia, Ukraine, so let's lighten it up. Here I am on the 4th of July, July 1st and July 4th, doing a segment, are you following George Washington's rules of civility on the 4th of July? Clearly, I am not in those photos. There we are, me and the anchor, or my anchor and myself, stuffing myself with a hot dog, and he's having a beer. This one in St. Louis, we're cheersing a beer together. It's fun. It was humorous. It was a demonstration on camera of what not to do. I just took George Washington's rules of civility, picked 5 of them from the 110, and applied it to us today. It was applicable. Does anyone here think in any arena, not just at the barbecue, but in politics, or even in the debates around historic sites and monuments, that civility is a relevant value? Right? So why remember? I can pull up George Washington's rules of civility and make it apply to a lot of things. So these are some of the ways that we can remember the significance of why remember. So let's go on to question number 2. What's the history being remembered? So once we've established significance with why remember, now we have to establish, well, what actually happened, right? Now that is, you're always going to have different lenses and interpretations, eyewitness accounts, but we can come to some kind of agreement on the basics of what happened. For example, at the Battle of Gettysburg, I can tell you that General Patton wasn't there. Or George Washington wasn't hanging out next to the nuclear bomb, right? We can get some basics. When did Gettysburg happen? Why, July 1, 2, and 3, who was there? What were some of the outcomes of the battle, and so on. Now, there are certain things we can kind of have fun discussing, and we certainly did when I worked at Gettysburg. But in terms of, an exact unit, exactly what they did and who went where. But in the bigger picture, we can establish that the Battle of Gettysburg happened and some of the things that are associated with that. But let me give you some more complicated situations. That's me in a Mardi Gras parade. So if I look at the history of Mardi Gras, what's the history there to be remembered? I think that's a little more complicated, right? You all might have a family history, or certainly I know, is it each of the crews? Is that what they call them? Each of the crews have their history, but I don't know how many of those I've verified. So I don't know how much is, just kind of oral history or what's going on. But there's certainly a history of how Mardi Gras started, how it's developed. Of course, it's caught on in other places, right? There's always also, I know Mobile claims to be the first Mardi Gras, and there's this craziness, but I know New Orleans really has the ownership of it. But again, I want us to understand that sometimes, while there are some basics we can agree to, sometimes a little more complicated when we dig in. How about here? This is in New Mexico. This is petroglyphs. Now, where I was here has 10,000 petroglyphs across this mesa, as they call it there, which is Spanish for plateau. A lot of plateaus in New Mexico, especially in northern New Mexico. So what's the history on these? Or those? It's hard to know, right? I don't know. We know that they came there across time. They're not all exactly at the same time. It's not one artist that did all these, right? We obviously know that there's obviously some kind of significance to this site. I don't know what kind of significance. Does it mean it's ceremonial? It could be, it could not be, it could just be there was a stop along the way very frequently. I don't know. Could be. There's so many theories, right? It's harder to establish what is a history to be remembered here. But it's a question worth asking if we were to, say, have a debate over how to use these. People use them all kinds of ways, or how to develop around them, or we should protect them or not, and all these different questions, right? Because there is a level to which we're okay with destroying this stuff. Like, people find arrowheads in their backyards all the time, which means obviously we're developing over something. And I'm not saying you have to preserve everything, but we have to understand where that level is, right? How about here? Here are a couple of monuments. This one is in Jamestown. So that's colonial, and this one's Civil War. What's the history here? It's a little more challenging, right? For example, do any of you know, not the history that this is depicting, forget the history is depicting for a moment, because remember, this is just a depiction of history. by monument group slash the artist, commissioned by the group, usually decades or centuries later, depending on which monument you're talking about. But what exactly is the history of those specific pieces? Who's the group behind them? Who's the artist? What was the artist's intention? And when they did the dedication ceremony, what were the speeches made about what they thought these monuments meant? I find that usually when we argue over monuments, we're not looking at that. We're projecting what I think the monument means, or what you think the monument means, or what you think it should mean. We're not looking at what is the history to be remembered, which in the monument's case has two layers. One, what it's depicting, but two, the particular lens through which that event being depicted is being viewed by those who created the monument and dedicated the monument. Those documents, more times than not, exist, but no one bothers to look at them. A lot of times that will give us some common ground to look at this stuff and at least have evidence instead of just what I believe and what you believe. And that helps us at least have a discussion. So let's look at how the monuments versus the sites operate here. This is a monument to Jeff Davis, president of the Confederacy. But Jeff Davis never really hung out there. I mean, it's a monument that came up after he was gone. Where Jeff Davis was the White House of the Confederacy, which is still in Richmond, Virginia. Now you go there, it's kind of funny. It's kind of like the Alamo. You know, it looks like it would be this grand space, right? But you know, if you've been to the Alamo, it's like all these huge buildings around it. And it's you know, how does this thing here? It's exactly the same thing. It's like a massive hospital around it. It's so funny. I drove by it 3 times before I found it. And I was someone that knows what I'm looking for. So I can't imagine, you know, but the point here is that monument, historic site. What is the history to be remembered? There's actually different histories to be remembered behind the dedication of this monument, who dedicated it, what their lens was, what their message was, and what their purpose was, because it wasn't Jeff Davis that put this up, versus what is the history to be remembered of the events that happened here at this historic site? That's a very different question. By Jeff Davis himself, and of course, the supporting staff that he had. And of course, coming back to the battlefield. That's me again, on the fields of Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. So we can come to some understanding of what happened at Pickett's Charge. I know there are military history debates, I've been in them. But overall, big picture, we understand that it happened on July 3rd, that a portion of the Confederates pierced through, that, you know, it was repelled back, and so on and so forth. Some of the basics we can all agree on what history to be remembered. So sometimes it's complicated, like whether it's Mardi Gras, whether it's the monument histories, whether it's the petroglyphs, and sometimes it's not as complicated to establish the history to be remembered. So the third question then, what does it mean to remember? So think about the progression here. We went from why remember, we established significance. Now that we got the significance, we said, well, let's look at the actual history now, what happened here. Now, if we have gotten some sense of what happened, we can go one more step and say, all right, so what does it mean to remember? For example, what inspired me for this question was there was a national park that was being proposed for really 10 years. It culminated in 2012, called the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. And when that park was proposed, initially it failed in Congress in 2012. The reason that it failed, well, there were a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons that it failed was this notion of, well, we're glorifying the bomb if we have a national park to it. We're celebrating the bomb if we have a national park to it. And some people didn't like that enough that there was enough votes to shoot it down. Eventually, a couple of years later, it did pass, but there was obviously conflict So today the national park is being established. But that reminded me, well, what does it mean to remember? Are we commemorating? Are we celebrating? Are we condemning? Are we condoning? What are we doing? Right? So we have to kind of think through, what does it mean to do so? Well, let's look at some examples. Another one of my favorite sites, Parlange Plantation. Now, this is off the False River in, of course, Louisiana. So what does it mean to remember this place? I'm curious, for you guys, what meaning do you attach to this? So let's say, now this is actually a site that is not only a National Historic Landmark, but it's acknowledged as a Smithsonian recognized site. Now, last I knew, now this could have changed, but last I knew, there are people that live there. It's a longtime family that has been there. So it's not, you know, it's not like, say, it's escaping me, across the river. Yeah, it's not a tour site per se. You can tour it, but you have to kind of set it up in advance. You got to take some extra steps. It's not like Laura Plantation. That's what I was getting at. It's not like Laura Plantation, right? So it's kind of it's kind of interesting. Like, it kind of still lives in a way, right? Because it's still a home, but it's also something you can check out. So for you guys, whether it's Parlange or something like it, what would you say? What does it mean to remember a place like this? I'm curious for y'all, especially being in the area. It does. So from your perspective, what does it mean? Yeah, yeah. And you can have different perspectives. All right. I'm just curious, what does it mean for you guys? Yeah. Okay. Can I say for the few, like, I'm going to say, maybe privilege, advantage, privilege. What else? What does it mean to you? Okay. There's no right or wrong answer here, guys. So just, you know. Okay. For me, this particular site, for me, what came to mind was family tradition, because the family is still there. It's a little bit, you know, different than some other sites. What else? At what time? Can't spell. All right. Anything else? Yeah, beauty. Yeah. It's actually one of the reasons it's on as a National Historic Landmark is that it is such a perfect example of that type of not only architecture and design, but the building. It has that traditional mud plaster. It was built in 1750. So it's one of the early ones. Has the horsehair. I mean, just the whole, I mean, like a beautiful example, beautiful example. And yes, when you go down in the lower level there, you see the bricks that this is on. Of course, there's that high foundation as many buildings here do because of the water. And yes, they have records of people making those bricks. So again, there's a whole system, right, that's in play. Now, you don't have the outbuildings. You have a few, but you don't have quite the same as you do at Evergreen. So to me, they're significant and interesting in different ways, you know. But yes, this view to me is also beauty. It's interesting, right? The same place can have beauty and slavery and both be right. You know what I mean? These stories have layers. What does it mean? It means multiple things. Oops, I'm pointing here. Let's go. All right, how about this? We're going to drift from sites and monuments to symbols. Now, that's me on the right side doing a program on the Confederate battle flag since the Civil War. That was back in like 2004 to 10. So I was covering about 1865 to the 2000s. It's an hour-and-a-half evening lecture that I used to do at Gettysburg. Now, that has nothing to do with the battle directly, but Gettysburg is sort of Civil War Disneyland. So while you got them there and we're talking Civil War, we can jump off to other topics, right? But there's a big difference when you talk about what does it mean to remember. It's a big difference between this flag that is literally from the battlefield. That's why it has the battle stitched on it. The men who fought and sacrificed under that flag would stitch on it the names of the battles that that flag and them made it through. That to me is a museum artifact in some ways, because there's only one of that particular flag for that unit. I can't buy it at the store. I can buy a reprint at the store, but not that, right? That's one of a kind. But then the flag was also used in these ways, generations later. This is a campaign for George Wallace, four-time governor of Alabama, whose most famous moment is when he has that speech, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, in the resistance to integration. And look at the symbolism they use there. And of course, here is a Klan ceremony where really they have multiple symbols they're using, not limited to the Confederate battle flag, but of course, one of those symbols is right there. Those are two different flags to me, right? One was the actual physical piece that was in the battle, but then these folks are using it this way also. These are all part of the history. The piece can have multiple layers. And then you have this use. I don't even know what to make of this part. Whether it's a top, this is of course the car called the General Lee in the Dukes of Hazzard show, water park in Florida. So sometimes it's just lighthearted, fun, rebellious. Again, I could promise you that the people you see in those photos are not Civil War veterans. They're people that are generations later.
Was it more to like a self-identifying the South and where you're from?
I would say it depends on the person, right? And depends on the context and the use. Because all of these are used at some point. So you'd have to figure out the context of how it's being used, right? So for example, when I had it up in my talk, I mean, I didn't mean anything by it other than I was talking about it, right? When some of the folks in the prior slide had it up, they're using a Southern identity in their view, what they see as a Southern identity, which they see as pure representation, which they see the pure being that segregated Jim Crow South. But in this case, I think it means something more like, I think just rebellious and fun. I'm not sure it's necessarily trying to be Southern in some of these. Like you might also remember, sometimes you see it less and less now, but on the truck, like I'm talking about the big rigs, right? The symbol of the open road. So it's not always that way, right? And then there's of course horrible ways it's been used, like Dylan Roof with the shooting of the black church in 2015. Now he didn't mean it that way, right? He meant it another way. That was really bad. And I think that moment changed a lot of things because that's when some states like South Carolina and others started to bring down the flag that they used to fly all the way till a few years ago. So my answer to that question is, it depends on the context and the person using it. And I think that's where we run into a challenge because you mean one thing when you put it up and I see something else when you put it up and now we clash, right? Because your intention and my interpretation, the send and receive is not being the same. Now, whose fault is that? Depends on the situation. I mean, you know, maybe the sender could be a little more sensitive to the context of how it can be read. On the other hand, the receiver could not jump to project their meaning either, right? So it's complicated. We have to be kind of understanding of that. Is that a fair answer? There's all these different layers, but I don't think there's only one way that it's used. It's my answer. Because of this, all of its different eras and it meant different things to different generations, right? How about this? Look at the body language on that guy. That reminds me of achievement. This is the atomic bomb. This is actually the one that they would do the practice run with down at Trinity site. the test one. So this is what it looked like. Look at body language versus body language of this guy. So when we talked about the atomic bomb and what does it mean to remember, well, which photo are we remembering, right? Because both of those are up here. The achievement is up here. I would say that maybe is an annihilation or the cautionary tale. So what does it mean to remember is complicated because we can be looking at different things. Does it mean we're glorifying? Does it mean we're celebrating? Does it mean we're condemning? It depends. My answer is it depends. It's a case-by-case basis. What if I showed you this instead? Also because of the atomic bomb. The moment of surrender. That to me ties to overcoming and victory. So what does it mean to remember? Look at all these different meanings of the same event just by looking through different lenses and different photos. So finally then, how remember? So we establish why with why remember and the significance. Then we establish some sense of what happened with what is a history to be remembered. And then we say, well, if we're going to remember this stuff in some fashion, we don't know how yet, but in some fashion, what does it mean? Right? And we just saw, well, there's layers to what it means. As you can see how there could be a lot of disagreement with just some of the examples we saw. So now we've established that. How do we do so? How do we capture the different stories and the layers and the perspectives? By being fair and saying, look, I can see how someone can see it multiple ways. Look at those different photos we looked at. I can see how someone can see it this way and that person can see it that way. And if those two people would understand that, then maybe we can move the conversation forward. Because there's clearly not one way to see these. So how do we do it? Is it through these reenactments? Live events? How about a tour or a program? That's me in my glory days. Look at that crowd. We're at what's called Devil's Den at the battlefield at Gettysburg. Very famous spot. The rocks, the famous rock outcroppings are like right behind the photographer here. Is this the way to remember? National Cemetery. These are the unknown soldiers at Gettysburg. There are many all over the place, but almost 1,000 soldiers that are buried there in the National Cemetery are unidentified. Talk about the ultimate sacrifice, sacrificing not just your life, but your identity. Literally sacrificing who you are. Is that the way to remember? How do we tell these stories? How about this building? One of my favorite buildings. You're seeing some of my favorites, I guess, between Evergreen, this one, I have a couple others. I can give you a top 5 list later if you want. This is a seminary building that is still active as a seminary, although this particular building is not, the campus around it is. At Gettysburg, it's a historic seminary before even the battle was there. It's one of the earliest ones and has had a lot of folks go through it, some names you recognize. It's a Lutheran seminary. And the other thing that's significant about it is during the battle, and if any of you have seen the battlefield, excuse me, the movie Gettysburg, or read the novel Killer Angels, they refer to a cupola. That's the cupola there. Yeah. It's one of the vantage points of the battlefield. And you see it all over the battlefield. You go around, you can always spot that cupola, as long as the trees aren't terribly grown in. This was also then converted to a field hospital during the battle and for months after, because of course the wounded soldiers were still in there, even though the battle left, there were still soldiers in there. There was major action and fighting right outside this building. Pretty significant building. Today you go there, It is a museum that commemorates multiple things. There's a Religion in America floor because of the significance of the seminary before you even get to the battle. There's a battlefield hospital floor. There's different parts that it interprets. When I was there, that's recent, that museum, when I was there, it was a local county historical society that was in there with archives and collections. And I used to hang out there, do all kinds of research all the time. Now that county historical society is in a building next door now. Or is it this building that we use to remember, to tell the stories? There's a Bryan house, the Abraham Bryan farm. So Abraham Bryan was sort of the patriarch of this household family. He was a widower with kids. And when the battle came to Gettysburg, he left. He left just a couple days before when the armies were kind of coming in the area. Remember, this is southern Pennsylvania, just barely over the Mason-Dixon line. It was just south, this is Maryland. That's the Mason-Dixon line. Maryland was a border state. Technically, it did not leave the Union, but the individuals there were very mixed, torn families. It's a slaveholding state that did not leave, but I mean, when General Lee invaded Maryland in 1862 with the Battle of Antietam, which is still the bloodiest day in American history, he was trying to rise up Maryland to get support. So Maryland is a really important state. Just north is the first free state, Pennsylvania, and you're just a few miles north. Well, there's a free Black man. And the Confederate Army had the right, according to their laws, the Confederate laws, to capture Blacks and enslave them because they were often assumed to be runaway slaves just by the fact that they're Black. So he was worried about that as a free Black man, so he left. Came back, farm was destroyed because this is one of the key areas of the battle. The farm is really in shambles when he comes back. Not the only farm that's in shambles. All kinds of farms, of course, are destroyed, but his is one of them. But what does that story tell us? When we talk about how to remember, how does this story fit into the story of the battle and the Civil War? Is how to remember something like this. There is a Fuller Lodge, National Historic Landmark. It's in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is where the atomic bomb was created, one of the key sites in the Manhattan Project, which of course led to the creation of the atomic bomb. But this photo here is prior to the Manhattan Project. There was an old boys ranch school, an old school for little boys called the Los Alamos Ranch School. All boys. It's kind of a mixture of Boy Scouts and liberal arts education. It was came up in the era of Theodore Roosevelt, the early 20th century, because they were trying to create little Theodore Roosevelts. And they were out west. Most of these kids were from, major cities in the East, elite families, going to a private boarding school far away. And they were going to learn to be tough, and they're going to learn to be disciplined, outdoorsy, and of course, liberal arts educated. That is very Theodore Roosevelt. Came from a well-off family, loved the West, the Rough Riders and that whole thing, right? Rough Riders come from New Mexico, but also was very well educated and kind of thought of himself as a 20th century Thomas Jefferson, right? So that building then was taken over by the Manhattan Project. When the Manhattan Project came to town, the Rand School was pushed out. This is 1943. And then when the Rand School, that kind of became the decline of Rand School. It closed within several years after that. Today, though, that building is still there and serves for community events. So it's not a museum. It's not a family home. It's still there, used by the community. Is that a way to tell the stories? A little bit different than the stuff we saw before, right? Still a community space. How about these monuments? The artistic depictions of what happened. All different depictions. How to remember. Are these one of the ways? What are the stories, not just of what they depict, but who is building these monuments, right? Who's putting them up? What's their message?
Were most of the monuments formed after the Civil War? Was it 20, 30 years after the war that these started coming up?
Depends where. Depends where you're talking about. It's hard to kind of say in a blanket statement across the country, but I would say generally they're a minimum one generation later. Minimum. sometimes a century later.
You know how they used the term the World War II, the greatest generation?
Mhm.
If you look at American history, mind you, we had several greatest generations. And the descendants of the soldiers, they were remembering their fathers and their grandfathers. And so these monuments went on like that, in remembrance of them and their sacrifice for that great generation.
So this is a bigger conversation. I'd love to talk more one-on-one, but I'll say this for now, that I think when people use the term greatest generation, that is very much a term of present historical memory, meaning that it's a way we today in our present think of a particular generation, but is not set in stone. If you ask some of these guys who the greatest generation is, well, they might not even known that generation, right? It might be before it even happened. So that to me is a totally it's not a physical monument, but it's kind of go in there in terms of how we think of something, and it's a depiction and a label. So I guess I'm kind of agreeing in the sense that there is different generations.
In Napoleonville, they have a World War I monument and they have a World War II monument. The World War I monument is substantially bigger and more impressive than the World War II. And I don't know the history, but it makes me wonder the losses of people who served in that parish, Ascension Parish, Napoleonville, must have been more devastating.
It's possible, or
for them to remember that by putting up, the World War I, for the World War II, maybe the losses were not as great.
it could be issues of funding. I mean, there's so many different issues. So you have to kind of go back and see, I think, what's going on there when they were put up. But I think in this case, I'll give you a quick example. On the Gettysburg battlefield, many of those monuments are put up by the veterans a generation or two later, but actually sometimes it's the veterans. Most of the time in Gettysburg's case, it's the veterans, not all of them, but most of the time. There's a different kind of politics there, which is my unit is better than your unit. My unit was more important to what happened than your unit. And there's a whole history of that as well. So it's not always generations later that kind of rewrite the memory, but sometimes even the participants, because there is unit pride and other things that are playing in there, right? So everyone wants to be the hero, especially at a major battle like Gettysburg, right? And so now there are monuments that come in a century later, obviously no veterans at that point. They have a very different feel and flavor than what's happening there. Now, it's hard though to extrapolate from Gettysburg because that's a very unique site. Other places, generally, it's often not the veterans. And you kind of have a peak in the 19 teens and 20s, I would say, of monuments. So you're kind of a couple generations moved at that point. It's much more than one. And you have another peak in the 50s and 60s. And the 50s and 60s ones, it's not always pretty as far as the reasons they're putting them up, if you look at some of the documents of what they're doing. So again, it's a case-by-case basis is what I would say. And I don't know sometimes the inner rivalries that are taking place and or what's going on in that present politics that influences the monuments. We can talk more afterwards if you like to, but I want to wrap up here so I can let the guys go and we can chat some more. But there's my big picture answer. Is that fair? Awesome. So finally then on the how to remember, here's a memorial, remembering the names. That's the Pennsylvania Memorial at the battlefield of Gettysburg. Now that's actually my photo, not a postcard. So that actually happened. That's not a pose. I just thought it was just perfect. So think about the different ways we've seen and how to remember. And here's a fun one. These guys right here. Right here. So that's me on TV talking about one of the quarters. I've done a series on this. I'm gonna pass this around, but don't steal my money. These are quarters, all right? It's two-sided. I want you to look at both sides. Now this is the American Women Quarters Program done by the US Mint. I know they're really shiny, but they're quarters. I promise they're not silver. They're actually quarters. They've just never been touched or used. You will find these circulating. You can go to your bank or order them from the US Mint. You can order rolls, however you want to do it. Every year for 4 years, starting this year, they're honoring 5 women. So 5, 5, 5, 5. so 20 women total. They already released the names for 2023. You can go on the US Mint website and see that those quarters are not out yet, but we know who they are. We don't know yet for 24 and 25. But obviously these are the 2022 quarters. What I love about these is, what an interesting answer to how to remember. The money in your pocket. Currency is where nations honor their heroes. And you carry it on you every day. And it literally has value. So let's take a closer look at one. There's a one with Maya Angelou. You can see it says her name right here. One of the more probably famous ones from the 2022. Some of the other ones you may have heard of, but they're not household names the way Maya Angelou is. So I chose this one for our example today. What I find fascinating about this is, symbolically, there's two sides to a coin, right? There are multiple stories that can take place. You can have multiple heroes, George Washington and Maya Angelou. And very importantly, there is space for both of them. You don't have to remove one to have the other. You can add. You might have noticed that a quarter for a couple of decades now has had all kinds of different commemorative versions come out on the tail side. Remember when they did the states? That took them 10 years because they were doing 5 a year. Then they moved on to other things. Right now they're doing American women quarters. So this is, to me, one of the most powerful symbols of remembering how this story of how to remember can play out. Two sides, really, there's multiple sides, I think, in real life. But on the quarter, we can't have a three-sided, four-sided quarter. So we're going to go with two. But again, look how we have two different heroes that are honored literally by the US government through its currency. And there is space for both, and you can have both without having to delete the other one. So as we wrap up, I want you guys to remember my favorite, okay, I have a top 5, but right now my favorite, just like the buildings, historic figure, which is George Wythe on the left side. Why do I love him? Now, Wythe is W-Y-T-H-E. So he was a tutor and a teacher to these two men on the right, Thomas Jefferson in the upper right, and John Marshall. He taught both of them. It was in the middle of the 18th century, around the same time Parlange Plantation was built in Louisiana. This is what was going on in Virginia. The reason I like him is because if you know the history that happened later, as the two young men on the right, Jefferson and Marshall, went on to have their careers. Of course, you know Jefferson, Declaration of Independence, which of course is the ideals of the nation. Third president of the United States, among other positions, right? Louisiana Purchase, as president, there's a million things we can go on. Established University of Virginia. John Marshall was an early Secretary of State, and most importantly later, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, still today, the longest serving Chief Justice in Supreme Court history. And I think, without debate, the most influential. There are cases from the early 19th century that we still cite today from John Marshall, a brilliant legal mind, incredibly influential, and really established the role of the court as we know it for generations later. But here's what's interesting. These two hated each other. They were rivals. They didn't see the law and politics the same way. They clashed over and over again. When Jefferson is president, Marshall is Chief Justice of the court. They disagree on the powers of the executive. They disagree on the powers of the court. Well, that's two of the three branches of government right there. But they were trained by the same guy, George Wythe. And that's why Wythe is my favorite. because he demonstrates that teaching is not about cloning yourself and having someone just be a little miniature you, but rather it's providing the skills and the tools for you to be very intelligent, like these two, to do great things in your career, to have brilliant minds of analysis, and somehow to think differently. Both very smart. That's what a teacher does. That's why, to me, WIF is so valuable, so influential, and such a great example of how we could think ourselves. So at last, if you want to learn more, you can check out any of these sites, information, contact me. There's some questions. Of course, we can hang out, but you can also contact me. But what I want you all to know, and if you looked at any of this content that I have, and a lot of this stuff, I mean, you go on YouTube, you can see a bunch of my TV segments for free. You go on here, you can actually watch my streaming online TV show that I have through Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire. But if you go through this link, you don't need to have a subscription. You access it for free. So you can check it out here. If you want to see all my stuff related to this project, you can go here, celebrityhistorian.com. You can see other things in addition to the video content. There's books, class, all kinds of different things I have on there. But what I want you to remember with this is that what I think we go through is that process I outlined in the beginning. That when we approach these questions, we remember those 4 questions. Why remember? What is the history to remember? What does it mean to remember? And how remember? How to tell those stories? And as we do so, to remember that 3-step process. Surprise perception. I hope some of you guys are surprised with something here about a perception. Provoke reflection, so you can be in a more reflective state. That's why I call my show Cleo the Muse. Musing is reflective and curious. It is not diabolical and didactic. And finally, to inspire learning. And I hope I've done that for you here today.